Punctuation are all those signs that we put around words, phrases, and clauses to help the reader process the information in our writing. Those are things like commas and semicolons, and the really basic thing to know about punctuation is that they don't really have any grammar powers of their own. There's not like a fundamental change to the meaning of a sentence when you add a comma somewhere. In fact, if you go into the history of it, a comma is actually, it's just a signal for a pause in speaking. That's what it is. It was back when people would, be reading something aloud and you want to tell the reader that now is a good time for you to take breath. That's when you would use a comma. But in writing, they've kind of evolved into this thing that helps the reader recognize where one clause ends and the other one begins. So that's why it's important to use punctuation properly, like commas and semicolons, because those signs really help readers process long sentences with multiple clauses. It tells the reader, okay, here's an independent clause, and here's a dependent finite clause, and here's a dependent non-finite clause. The comma and the semicolon, those are signals to the reader of the underlying structure of the sentence. So we want to use them properly in order to help the reader process our writing. And in that way, you can really think about punctuation like the traffic lights of our writing. When there's a green light, cars are just going to be going through an intersection. And when there's a red light, it's a hard stop. That's a period. The yellow light is a signal to the driver to slow down. There's a change coming. And in driving, that change, it means that there's going to be a red light coming soon. But in writing, the yellow light, which is the comma, that's a signal to the reader that here's a place where one independent clause ends, and here's the place where the other one begins. Same with the semicolon. So these punctuation marks are an alert to the reader of the underlying structure in a sentence. They don't have grammatical powers of their own. If you put a comma somewhere, it's not suddenly going to change something from an independent clause to a dependent clause or anything like that. Leaving these punctuation points out of a sentence, omitting them, can cause confusion on the part of the reader. So take a look at these sentences. We have an ambiguous sentence in the middle in the big letters. Without any punctuation, it says, I would love to see her and the baby, and I will be here all day. So without a comma, it's really hard to tell if we're talking about a clause such as the one on top, which says, I would love to see her, and the baby and I will be here all day. Is that what the writer is saying? Or is the writer saying on the bottom, I would love to see her and the baby, and I will be here all day. Adding the comma in the proper place allows the writer to see where one independent clause ends and the other one begins. So in the first case, we would say, I would love to see her and the baby. I would love to see both of them. And furthermore, and I will be here all day, right? Or if you put the comma elsewhere, it changes the meaning. You would then have, I would love to see her, and furthermore, and the baby and I will be here all day. In either case, the comma isn't really changing the meaning of the sentence. It's just highlighting the structure underneath the sentence to tell the reader, here's where one clause ends and here's where the next one begins. So they're very useful whenever we're joining clauses together. In the first case, we can bring together simple sentences and we can leave them as simple sentences, but just join them with sentence connectors. Another kind of equal relationship that we can make is between clauses. So we can bring independent clauses together in a relationship with a coordinating conjunction. Those are called compound sentences. And the third kind is complex sentences, in which we join an independent clause to a dependent clause. So in this lecture, let's take a look at some of the patterns that you can use to help clarify the meaning in your own writing. In the first case, we want to join simple sentences together. And whenever we're joining simple sentences together, there are basically these 1, 2, 3, 4 patterns of punctuation. In the first case, we have a simple sentence. It's just one sentence, so it doesn't require a comma. Science and technology are the root of all the wealth and prosperity that we see in society. So that's just one simple sentence. There's no coordination or conjunction or anything, so we can just put a period on the end of it. Perfect. In the second case, you could be joining two simple sentences together using a sentence connector, such as however. In this case, I have however, but you can use any sentence connector here, such as nevertheless, in addition. Any one of those will fit into this same pattern. So in this case, you can imagine an independent clause coming before this, and then a sentence connector, however, comma, Grammarly suggestions are less helpful to experienced writers. So in that case, it's important to note that the first sentence ends with a period, and then between the sentence connector and the next independent sentence, there's a comma. In the second case, sometimes it can be helpful to split the second simple sentence into two parts and to put the sentence connector in the middle of those two parts. In that case, you're going to want commas on either side of the sentence connector. So in this case, we have the first independent clause says Grammarly incorporates both machine learning and rule-based algorithms into its products. And then the next simple sentence is going to be split in the middle by a sentence connector. So we have no computational linguistics, however, labored over imparting our rules of language to GPT-2. So why did we split it in the middle here? Well, take a look at that second independent clause, the second simple sentence. It's quite long, isn't it? It's quite heavy. No computational linguistics labored over. What did they not labor over? They did not labor over imparting our rules of language to whom? To GPT-2. So that's very long and heavy, and we don't want to put all that information onto the other side of the sentence connector. Instead, we can take one of those long noun phrases, those long nominal groups, put that on one side of the sentence connector, put the sentence connector in the middle, and then put the other nominal group on the other side. So we have no computational linguists. However, they did not labor over imparting our rules of language to GPT-2. So the reason we made that decision over the second pattern, as we see here, the reason this third one is more helpful in this case is that it's a long, heavy sentence. And so putting that sentence connector in the middle helps the reader break up the information and process the sentence. And in the last case, it's a little bit less common, but we can also put that sentence connector at the end of the sentence. And it follows the same rule of the first case. The sentence connector needs to be set off from the independent clause by a comma. So we have, the authors assured us that the fossil will be available to qualified researchers. Experience leaves some amber researchers wary, however. The choice about whether to put it at the beginning or the end has a lot to do with the context of what you're writing in. In this case, you might imagine that the next sentence is going to explain why some researchers are wary. So the sentence connector that's signaling contrast, it comes at the end because it's kind of preparing the reader for the sentence that follows. There's not one right or wrong way to do this. You can choose whatever seems best or sounds right. But the point is that you can move a sentence connector around the sentence into these different positions, but it's always going to be set off from that independent clause by a comma. The next kind of relationship that requires some punctuation are compound sentences. Those are the ones where we join two independent clauses in an equal relationship, and we use coordinating conjunctions to do that, which we call fanboys. And there are really only two patterns of punctuation that you need to know for compound sentences. And the first one is independent clause, comma, coordinating conjunction, independent clause, period. So in this case, we have two independent clauses. We have genetics is more complicated than we think, and we have little scientific data is available to support claims about nature versus nurture. So we want to join those two clauses in a relationship, in an equal relationship. We're saying they're both equally important. We're going to use the coordinating conjunction and we set off that coordinating conjunction with a comma. If we don't have the comma there, then the reader can get quite confused. If you try to read the sentence to yourself without the comma and try to process it, it seems something like genetics is more complicated than we think and little scientific data is. Like up until the point where you see is, you think that this whole thing is this one independent clause. But then there's this other finite verb. So all of a sudden you have to say, oh, that was actually two clauses, and you need to go back and process it again. So the comma is really helping the reader to see that, these are two independent clauses. In the second case, we can have a semicolon. Be very careful with semicolons. This is kind of funny. Some writers have strong opinions about semicolons. Kurt Vonnegut calls semicolons the hermaphrodite of English writing. And the reason is because a semicolon is really just kind of a sneaky period. It's basically a period. It's no different. You put it at the end of an independent clause, and then you can begin another independent clause after that. But some writers think, okay, that's just cheating. Independent clauses belong in their own simple sentences, so why are we joining these together? Here's my recommendation. Use semicolons whenever both the independent clauses are showing opposite sides of the coin. You're saying not this, but that. You have the negative on one side of the semicolon and the positive on the other one. So in this case, let's take a look. You don't need to think about how to ride a bicycle once you've mastered balancing and steering, semicolon. However, you do need to think about how to avoid pedestrians walking in the bike lane. So these are two clauses. They're independent clauses, but they're both about the same subject. One is giving you a negative account of that subject, and the other is giving you a positive one. They're in a complementary relationship, kind of two sides of the same coin. In that case, I think a semicolon is great. It's very useful because it's showing both sides of the same idea together in one simple sentence. They're joined by this semicolon, and then if you want, you can include a sentence connector. You don't have to. If you choose to include a sentence connector, then the same rule applies. You need a sentence connector and then a comma to set it off from that next independent clause. Here's another example of the two sides of the same coin effect with a semicolon. So we have, this does not mean that there is something wrong with it, semicolon. It just means that it is not science, right? So it doesn't mean this, it does mean that. A semicolon is great in that. I don't think those need to be two independent sentences. Join them together with a semicolon and you get two sides of the same coin. And the last use case of punctuation is with complex sentences. Those are sentences when we join an independent clause to a dependent clause. And there are basically three patterns that you need to know for complex sentences. The first one is when we join an independent clause to a dependent clause with a subordinating conjunction, we don't need a comma. The dependent clause does not need to be set off with a comma, and that's because it's not its own thing. It can't stand on its own, right? It's hanging off of the independent clause. So we don't need to separate it with a comma. We don't need to say to the reader, hey, here's where one idea ends and here's where the next one begins. The dependent clause, it depends on the independent clause. So they're joined. You don't need a comma there. So that's why you never should really see a comma before words like because. So here's an example. AI can figure out its own rules for how to accomplish a task when it is trained with the right data. So it is trained with the right data. That's a finite clause, but we're making it a dependent finite clause by using the subordinating conjunction when. And in that case, it doesn't need a comma because it's no longer an independent clause. Now, as we'll see in number 3, you can just switch that. And when you put the dependent clause first, it does need a comma. We'll look at that in number 3. But before we get to that, take a look at number 2 here. Independent clause, comma, non-finite dependent clause. That's different. Up here, we had independent clause, finite dependent clause. I was using a subordinating conjunction. But in this case, we have independent clause, comma, non-finite dependent clause. Here's an example. A butterfly flapping its wings may set off a chain reaction, comma, causing a tsunami on the other side of the world. That non-finite dependent clause, we need to help the reader recognize that here's where the independent clause ends, and here's where a non-finite dependent clause begins, and the comma helps us do that. And in the last case, it's very much like number 1, but we've just switched the independent clause and the dependent finite clause. So sometimes you can have the dependent finite clause come at the beginning of the sentence. Those are sentences that'll begin with, because this, comma, that. Like in that case, when the dependent clause comes first, you need to have a comma between it and the independent clause. Again, because it'll really confuse the reader if you don't have it there. So here's an example. Because human beings were shaped by evolutionary processes to pursue success, not happiness, people enthusiastically play zero-sum status games. You can imagine the sentence written otherwise. You could put the independent clause first and it wouldn't need a comma. You could just as easily say, People enthusiastically play zero-sum status games because human beings were shaped by evolutionary processes. Okay, so why did they choose to write it that way? Well, it's all about what you want to emphasize, what comes before and after that sentence. The last item in a sentence is generally the thing that receives stress. So in this case, writing it this way helps really emphasize that last item, that zero-sum status game. If you wrote it the first way, then the thing that would receive emphasis would be to pursue success, not happiness. That would come at the end of the sentence. But in this case, the writer chose not to emphasize that part, so you can move the dependent clause first. But in that case, you need to separate it with a comma. A few quick tips before we close here. As I've been saying, when the independent clause comes first and the dependent finite clause comes second, you don't need a comma. It's useful to use a comma there whenever you really want to show strong contrast. So in this case, you don't need a comma here, but it's a nice feature of style to include one. So in this sentence, it says, most people hold negative views of gossip and gossipers, comma, even though almost everyone gossips. So even though is a subordinating conjunction, just like because or when. You don't need a comma there, but because we're showing strong contrast between these two clauses, it's a good feature of style to use a comma there. Another style tip with punctuation is to notice that usually sentence connectors will come at the beginning of a sentence. However, there are a few sentence connectors that generally don't come at the beginning of a sentence. You might see it written sometimes, but I think personally it's kind of bad style. In this case, it would be like thus. So thus is a sentence connector, but it generally doesn't go at the beginning of a sentence. It's much better in the middle of a sentence. So here's the example. Thus, we are convinced of our own virtue, but quick to see bias, greed, and duplicity in others. Well, it would be much better to write that with the sentence connector in the middle of the sentence. So as we would say, we are thus convinced. We are thus convinced of our own virtue, but quick to point out. Thus comes more naturally in the middle of the sentence. The same is true for also. You really should not begin a sentence with also. Never begin a sentence with also. If you want to put the sentence connector at the beginning of a sentence that is showing addition to the previous one, then you can use in addition. But if you want to use also, do not write also, comma, full sentence. You can put also in the middle of the sentence, and that'll be much better stylistically. For example, also, this is about Twitter. Also, human verification would likely reduce the frequency of trolling and other antisocial behavior online. Much better would be human verification would also likely reduce the frequency of trolling and other antisocial behavior online. So here's a little quiz. Up top, we have all the different punctuation patterns that we've been practicing, and down below we have a sentence that has an error in it. So take a look at the sentence, try to find the error, and see which pattern above would you use to correct this sentence. Major transitions in biological evolution are the series through which multicellular organisms first appeared and then developed new symbiotic relationships. So we see "and" here, and that's probably making us think that there might be two independent sentences in here. But when we really look, we see there's really only one independent clause in this sentence. We see major transitions. What are they? They are a series. And in that series, within that, through that series, organisms first appeared and then developed. So there's only this one independent clause in the sentence. So it actually doesn't need anything other than a period. It's just one simple sentence. Here's another one. There's an error in the sentence below. So use the patterns that you see above to try to make a correction to this sentence. An autocracy can deploy propaganda or use fear to motivate the behaviors it desires, but a democracy depends on widely internalized acceptance of rules, norms, and institutions. So we have two independent clauses here. We have one independent clause about an autocracy and then one about a democracy. So here we have the coordinating conjunction but, and we need to signal to the reader that there are these two independent clauses here by putting a comma right before but. Here's another one. Read this sentence, try to find the error, and then use one of the punctuation patterns above to make a correction. Number 3, we have a mean tweet doesn't kill anyone. It's an attempt to shame or punish someone publicly while broadcasting one's own virtue. Okay, so this is a great example of when we can use a semicolon. Take a look. We have 2 comments about a mean tweet. A mean tweet doesn't kill anyone. A mean tweet, a mean tweet is an attempt to shame or public someone. So it doesn't kill anyone, but it is an attempt to shame or publicly punish someone while broadcasting one's own virtue. So these are 2 sides of the same coin, which is a perfect opportunity to use a semicolon.
Last one. Try to find the error in this sentence and then use the patterns above to make a correction.
Continuing with mean tweets here, we have a mean tweet is more of a dart than a bullet, causing pain but no fatalities. So we have first an independent clause. It is more of a dart than it is a bullet. And then we have a dependent non-finite clause here, telling us that this whole clause, it caused something. It caused pain, but no fatalities. So we need to put a comma between an independent clause and a non-finite dependent clause.
So in sum, you don't need to memorize a full list of rules about commas and semicolons. There are really only a few patterns that you need to get familiar with. So please keep these patterns in mind whenever you're editing your own writing, because it's very important now that we're starting to combine clauses together to make sure that we help the reader see the difference between these clauses using proper punctuation.